The glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor, and every single person at that table turned to look at him like he was something they had accidentally stepped in. His name was Daniel Mercer. And in that moment, standing in the middle of the most expensive private dining room in the city, wearing a white button-down with a small grease stain near the collar, holding a tray he had just fumbled, he looked exactly like what they assumed he was. A nobody. A man who carried other people's food for a living. A man who had no business being within 20 feet of the kind of money sitting around that table. The girlfriend's father barely glanced at him. The mother pursed her lips the way people do when they smell something unpleasant. And the brother, 26 years old in a suit that cost more than most people's rent, actually laughed. Not the polite kind. The kind that is meant to land. What none of them knew, what they could not have imagined, was that the man standing in front of them in that stained shirt owned the building they were sitting in. He owned the restaurant, the hotel above it, the block it sat on, and 43 other properties in 7 cities across the country. He had more money than the girlfriend's father had ever seen in one place, and he had chosen to spend his Wednesday evening carrying trays and pouring water because he wanted to see exactly the kind of people his girlfriend came from before he made the most important decision of his life. He was not a poor waiter. He was a billionaire in disguise, and everything that happened next would change the course of every single person at that table. If you have ever wondered whether the version of yourself that shows up when no one important is watching is actually the real you, this story is going to make you think very hard about that question. Stay right here, because what this man discovered in that dining room over the course of one evening is the kind of thing most people spend their entire lives never learning about the people closest to them. And if this already has you curious, hit that subscribe button right now and like this video, because what comes next in this story took a turn that even the people involved never saw coming. Let's go back a few weeks before that broken glass. Daniel Mercer grew up in a part of Cincinnati that people with money tend to forget exists. His father worked at a printing warehouse for 31 years. His mother cleaned office buildings 3 nights a week while also working the morning shift at a dry cleaning counter. They were not poor in the way that makes the news. They were poor in the quiet, grinding, invisible way, where nothing is ever quite enough, and you learn very early that the world does not tilt in your favor just because you are trying hard. Daniel learned that lesson young, and he held on to it the way some people hold on to photographs of people they have lost. He put himself through college on a combination of loans, a partial scholarship, and weekend shifts at a restaurant near campus. He slept 5 hours a night for 4 years. He graduated with a degree in finance and $700 in his checking account. What happened after that? The series of calculated risks, the one investment that should not have worked but did, the second business that tripled the returns of the first, the commercial real estate portfolio that began as a single distressed property he bought for $42,000 and sold 3 years later for 9 times that amount. All of that is a separate story. What matters for right now is that by the time Daniel was 38 years old, his net worth had crossed $1 billion, and the only people who knew that for certain were his attorney, his accountant, and a very small circle of people he trusted completely. He did not live the way people imagine billionaires live. He drove a 7-year-old sedan. He owned one home, a modest 4-bedroom in a quiet suburb, not a compound, not a penthouse, just a house with a good kitchen and a yard with one oak tree he had planted himself. He wore plain clothes, not because he was performing humility, but because genuinely did not care what he wore. He had seen what happens to people when the trappings of wealth become the point, and he had decided a long time ago that was not going to be him. Which meant that when people met Daniel Mercer in an ordinary context, they almost never had any idea who he was. He had been dating a woman named Claire for 8 months, and those 8 months had been, in his own words, the first time in years he had felt like a person rather than a portfolio. Claire was warm and honest and funny in the specific way that means someone has actually paid attention to the world. She was a landscape architect who drove a pickup truck and made the best scrambled eggs he had ever eaten. He was, in the careful way he approached everything in his life, starting to believe this might be the real thing, which is exactly why he needed to know about her family before he went any further. He had heard things, in the way you hear things when you pay attention to small details. Claire rarely talked about family dinners with joy. She mentioned her father's opinions the way people mention weather they have learned to expect but cannot control. She changed the subject whenever her brother came up in conversation. Daniel noticed these things, filed them away, and then one evening he proposed what sounded like a simple idea. A private dinner, him and Claire's family, at a restaurant he knew well. What he did not tell Claire was that he had arranged with the restaurant manager, a man he had personally hired 2 years earlier, to let him work a shift in the dining room that night. Not as the owner, as the help. He wanted to see them without armor. He wanted to see the version of these people that came out when they believed they were in the presence of someone they did not need to impress. Because here is something Daniel had learned over 2 decades of watching human behavior from every possible angle. People are almost never who they say they are, but they are almost always exactly who they are to the waiter. The father, whose name was Gerald, ordered a bottle of wine and immediately began correcting Daniel on the pronunciation of the vineyards region, loudly enough for the adjacent table to hear. He had gotten the pronunciation wrong himself, but the performance was not about accuracy. It was about establishing, for anyone paying attention, that he was the kind of man who knew about wines and other men did not. He sent the bread back twice, not because anything was wrong with it, Daniel had specifically checked, but because sending things back was a way of reminding everyone in proximity where they stood. The mother, Patricia, did not make eye contact with Daniel once over the course of 90 minutes. Not when he poured her water, not when he described the evening specials, not when she addressed a question directly to him about whether the fish was fresh. She looked slightly to his left each time, at a spot on the wall approximately 4 inches from his face, as though eye contact with a person in his position might be somehow contagious. It was one of those behaviors so habitual, so deeply embedded, that she probably did not even know she was doing it, which somehow made it worse. The brother, whose name was Todd, had a specific move that Daniel recognized immediately. It is a move people use when they feel the need to establish dominance in every room they enter. He made a joke about the menu prices being reasonable for people on a budget, glanced at Daniel, and smiled the way people smile when they are waiting to see whether you understood the insult. Daniel smiled back, refilled his water glass, and said nothing. It was the kind of nothing that contains a great deal. Claire, for her part, was visibly uncomfortable within the first 15 minutes. She kept trying to redirect conversations. She apologized to Daniel twice for things that were not her fault. He noticed the way she held her shoulders when she was around these people. Tighter, higher, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime bracing. She was not her family. That was the thing that was becoming very clear, very fast. She was someone who had grown up inside that environment and chosen, quietly and deliberately, to become something different. That took a kind of internal strength Daniel recognized because he had needed it himself. He came back to the table one final time toward the end of the meal. Gerald was mid-story about a business deal that Daniel, even from a distance, could tell was embellished significantly. As Daniel reached across to clear a glass, Gerald stopped talking, looked at him, and said, without any particular cruelty, but with the absolute casual confidence of someone who has never once questioned his right to say it, "Be careful, that's crystal." Then he turned back to his story without waiting for a response. Daniel set the glass down gently. He straightened up. He looked at Gerald for exactly 2 seconds, and then he went back to the kitchen. This is the part of the story that the people who share it always pause on, because what happened in the days that followed is where it stops being a story about a dinner and starts being a story about consequences. Daniel met with his attorney the following morning, not to initiate anything aggressive, that was never his style, but to make a decision he had already been considering and now felt ready to make with complete clarity. He called Claire that afternoon and told her he loved her and that he needed to tell her something he had been carrying for a while. That conversation lasted 3 hours. What came after, it changed both their lives in the way that only true honesty between two people can. What Daniel eventually chose to do with the information he had gathered over that dinner is the kind of thing that gets told and retold not because it was dramatic, but because it was so precisely calibrated. Gerald's primary business had been quietly struggling for years, held together with optimism and selective accounting. Daniel's real estate company, operating under a name Gerald would not have recognized, was in a position to either become Gerald's largest landlord or, depending on how a certain renegotiation went, to decline that role entirely. Daniel chose to decline it. No confrontation, no speech, no moment where he stood up at a second dinner and removed a mask while everyone gasped. Just a clean, quiet decision made by a man who understood that not all power has to announce itself. The most lasting power never does. The family found out who Daniel was gradually, in the way most important truths arrive, not all at once, but in pieces that slowly assemble into a picture you cannot unsee. When that picture finally came together for Gerald, the silence that followed reportedly lasted nearly a full minute. Todd went very quiet for a long time after that. Patricia, according to Claire, cried, though no one was entirely sure what she was crying about. And Claire, who had known the full truth for weeks by then, simply sat across from her family and felt something she described as a specific kind of tired finally lifting. There is a channel called Shadowlight Stories that collects exactly these kinds of moments. Not because wealth is the point, but because what these stories reveal about human behavior is something most of us feel in our own lives, in smaller rooms, with smaller stakes, but identical dynamics. The waiter who gets talked over. The assistant who gets ignored. The neighbor nobody bothers to learn anything about. Power does not always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears a stained collar and a patient expression and knows exactly how much time it has. Here's the thing that sits with you when you really think about this story. Daniel did not need to do what he did. He could have shown up to that dinner as himself and watched the family perform in an entirely different direction. He could have simply trusted Claire's word about who they were. He could have let it go entirely. But he understood something fundamental about information. that the version of a person you see when they believe the stakes are low is the truest version you will ever see. Not the version dressed up for a good impression, not the version on best behavior, the version that lets itself be fully visible because it believes nobody significant is watching. That is the question worth sitting with tonight. Not who are you when everything is on the line, but who are you when you think it does not matter? Who are you to the person you will never need anything from? Who are you to the stranger you will never see again? Because somewhere, in every room, there is someone paying closer attention than you realize. Drop a comment below and tell me this. Have you ever misjudged someone because of what they did for a living, or been misjudged yourself? I genuinely want to know, because the answers in the comments on this one always reveal something true about how we all move through the world. And if this story hit differently than you expected, share it with someone in your life who needs the reminder that dignity is not a uniform, and character is not a credential. Some of the most important people in any room are the ones you have not looked at yet. The most expensive thing a person can lose is not in their bank account. It is the moment someone watches how they treat the help and chooses accordingly.